Hello. It's a frigid May weekend here on the eastern seaboard of the United States. Coronavirus deaths have passed the 75,000 count, at least. Unemployment claims have passed the 30 million count, at least. A tsunami of business bankruptcies is on the way. And from what I read, there's a rampage of murderous super hornets about to attack North America. These are tough times, but we have a happy day coming up. This weekend is Mother's Day, and I wish you all joy of your families and that you are able to celebrate either in real life or virtually with those you love best. This important family holiday. It's been a while since I've been able to record an answer to reader mail. Thank you for the many messages I've received. I cannot do justice to all of them, but I have a big stack, and in order to complete within a reasonable period of time, I'm going to plunge right into it and answer right away. The first message is from a reader named Jeff in Los Angeles. My question is about your new book. Love the title, by the way. Thank you. The new book is Trumpocalypse, March 26th. It releases from HarperCollins. Perhaps you've mentioned it elsewhere, but I'm curious if you had time to include anything about the pandemic in your first edition. If no, what, if anything, do you wish you had had time to include? I'd also be curious to hear you talk a little bit about the challenge of writing your book in such turbulent political times, when it seems there's a Watergate scandal a day, like you've said. The challenge of writing something worth writing and worth readers spending their time reading seems a bit more difficult when there really is so much to say. Well, I was able to include something about the pandemic. HarperCollins bent every nerve, and we were able to stop production of the book in time for me to rewrite the first two chapters of the book to include reference to the pandemic and then make changes in the body of the book, again, to be cognizant of what had happened. The book was written in the premonition that something pretty bad was going to happen to the United States in 2020. My own assumption had been that we were going to have an economic slowdown and maybe even a recession driven by President Trump's trade wars, also possibly some kind of foreign policy crisis with Iran, some kind of military action. And the book is written, I didn't directly address those because I didn't know they were going to happen, but it's written on the assumption that something like that would happen and there are references to it. The bad thing that did happen is so much bigger and badder than I imagined, and I thank HarperCollins for making it possible for me to address it in the first two chapters. But as Jeff says, it is a problem writing a book in the Trump era because things do move so fast and so many hideous and horrible things keep happening. I responded to this in two different ways with two different books. In my first book about the Trump presidency, Trumpocracy, I wrote the book in really quite a short span of time over the summer of 2017, between about early June and August. Trumpocalypse was written over a much longer period of time, really 2 years. And so it had a bigger problem of focus. And because Trumpocalypse is in many ways a much more ambitious book than Trumpocracy, it tries not only to record what is happening, but to envision a way to a better and more stable American democratic world in the future. The challenge was even greater. One of the things I really do look forward to after this presidency is over is settling down to write about things that don't move and to have more time to really delve into them. But it often seems that I write very fast, but what I say to friends and colleagues and editors is I write fast because I think slow. And my method is I don't start writing until I really know exactly what I'm going to do. I spend a lot of time researching and reading and thinking. And when I can, I try with an article to write the first and the last sentence of the article before I do anything else, to know where I'm starting and where I'm going. With a book, at least to have a working outline of the book, and certainly the first line of the book, and a very clear idea of how I want to finish, if not exactly literally the concluding line. You can't, if you don't have a map, you will get lost. But keeping pace with the times, the one thing that makes it easier is that while there are so many different scandals and outrages, the basic shape of them doesn't change, because the nature of this presidency is fundamentally criminal character. That is a constant. And Donald Trump does not really have so very many tricks. So once you figure out his psychology, once you figure out his methods, the fact patterns change, but the deeper truths that you're trying to address, those remain surprisingly stable. And I feel, and I hope readers agree that the book I published in 2018, Trumpocracy, stands up and will stand up to the test of time. Trumpocalypse is written with an even longer time horizon. As I say, it's very much about the post-Trump future, and I hope it'll be worth referencing for many years after Donald Trump leaves the presidency. A reader named Judy writes, one of the forgotten events of the past year that many thought would sink the current administration was the appearance of the Mueller report. Is the 2-year effort of Robert Mueller and his staff of 17 now a moot point? Was it all a waste of time? I suppose not many people bothered, but I read parts of it and found it shocking. Has America in general become somewhat indifferent to political corruption? It would seem so. How can it be that Trump, who had no relevant political resume to speak of, could become such a significant and contentious actor on the world stage? Well, one of the things that people have often said, it became a gag during the Trump years, is LOL, nothing matters. My theory is that everything matters. It's just that there's a whole lot of everything. And it's difficult for people to encompass all of it because that we are changing so many minds across such a vast continent. But the Mueller report, and I talk about this in Trumpocalypse, was a disappointment. I have a joke there that if curiosity killed the cat, then any of Robert Mueller's felines can look forward to a long and complete life. Because I am struck, and I was struck as I read it, by how many things he just seemed not to care about or not to be interested in. The most important omission from the report was the question, why? Why did the Russians take such tremendous risks to help Donald Trump? I mean, everyone had to believe the conventional view that Hillary Clinton was probably going to win. And given the brazenness of what the Russians did for Trump, that it was likely they were exposing themselves to some kind of consequence, maybe retaliation from a future probable Clinton presidency. Why were they so eager for Donald Trump? What was it about him that they knew? And we all have our theories about that, and there's a lot of reporting about it. But Robert Mueller seemed to have decided that was just not his department. He decided if he was on the look for prosecutable crimes, and if what he found was not a crime or not prosecutable, he didn't keep looking. So questions like, what was the business relationship between Donald Trump and Russian interests before he entered politics? Not of interest to Robert Mueller, and it should have been. And there are many other gaps and omissions in the report. I think it was, it just succumbed to his own limits. And I think maybe there's a larger theme here, which is the people who rise in American government are usually very capable, very well informed, very public spirited. But the government is bound by rules, and you rise in government by your ability to adapt to those rules until the rules almost become part of your personality. And when you encounter something as novel and disturbing and as rule bending as Donald Trump, I think it leaves a lot of people like a former director of the FBI kind of baffled and helpless because they don't have a toolkit to deal with this person, and to deal with this person not as someone outside government, but as somebody inside government. Not only inside government, but at the very head of it. A question for your YouTube Q&A, and this I didn't note a name for this question. I just saw your tweet about the efficiency of Canada's small business loan program. I had been on the phone or on Zoom with two friends of mine who own a winery in Prince Edward County, and they described the process of applying for help. It took them 10, 12 minutes, pressing the button to apply, watching the little ball spin around. As one of my friends said, it was the longest 2 minutes of his life. But at the end of the 2-minute ball spinning, they'd been approved. And 48 hours later, they had 40,000 Canadian dollars in their bank account, which was sufficient for them to stay in business through the next few months. And that I told a little story about that on Twitter, not suppressing the names. And I was surprised at just the extraordinary response to that tweet by so many Americans who had such contrastingly terrible experiences trying to get some help from the U.S. government. As the reader continues, which is astonishing compared to the morass we have in the United States. My question is, why? The U.S. has been suffering from ineffective government for decades, while other countries clearly have avoided that fate. I'd be curious if you have some insight into this phenomenon. I suspect the most interesting answers are somewhere deeper than, well, the US doesn't spend enough on its government, but more fundamental than, gee, all those loan systems were written in COBOL. I think it is a profound question. For me, and maybe I'm biased here by the contrast between Canada and the United States, one of the biggest differences between the two countries is the United States doesn't have a real full civil service in the way that Westminster countries do. That is, in Canada, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Health, those are politicians who have run for office. And they will have staffs of political loyalists whom they appoint. And it might be, depending on the department, they might have a dozen such people to appoint, maybe a couple of dozen, certainly not more than a couple of dozen. And then below that, they are dealing with career people. So there's an assistant minister, there's what's called a deputy minister, and then an assistant deputy minister, and then the deputy minister and the assistant deputy minister, they're career people, and they rise through a bureaucracy for their expertise, for their knowledge of the bureaucracy. Now that system has a disadvantage. It's very hard to change. If a minister arrives with a whole bunch of new ideas, that minister is going to have to get them past a deputy minister who will say that's not how we've been doing things for the past 20 years, and will have arguments at hand to shoot down the new ideas. That the deputy minister and the assistant deputy minister will protect the status quo. Then it's not ideological. Maybe it is ideological a little, but it's mostly a defense of the status quo. So if you're a reformist, it's a system that is harder to change than the American system, where the president's people can become not only cabinet secretaries, but 3 tiers down. They become, the undersecretary and the assistant secretary and the deputy assistant secretary. Those will all be political appointees. But a lot of the ideas that people bring with them from private life into public life are not very good and not very workable, and they lack expertise. And in the American system, when you are wiping away the top 3 tiers of government all the time, there are people who you staff the government, if you've staffed it, and the Trump people have often left the government unstaffed, but if you've staffed it with people who don't know things like, well, how do we send checks out on a very large scale in the event of some economic shock? I think one of the real lessons of the Trump era has been that the United States government lacks the kind of state capacity that other developed countries have. And the civil service is not the whole of that explanation, but it's an important part. I talk in Trumpocalypse a lot about this. And one of the things I argue in that book is that there's a lot of pressure these days for what you might call a lowercase p new era of progressivism. But to my way of thinking, maybe the most urgent need is capital P progressivism, like the progressives of a century ago, who are focused on making government work better, being less corrupt, more efficient, more streamlined, more professional. That may be the most crying need that has been exposed by the Trump experience. This message also doesn't have a name. Hi, David. Although I lean progressive, I've been a fan of your work since reading Comeback in 2008. Thank you. Since the end of the Cold War, the American public seems less and less willing to support and subsidize the post-World War II American-led order, culminating in the election of Donald Trump. While that may seem short-sighted and bad for world peace, it is not irrational for someone in Middle America to conclude that, at least since 2000, the order and globalization are not working well for them. How can the American political establishment regain the American public's support to maintain the world order, which has bought 70 years of peace and prosperity in the West? What would you do to modify the world order institutionally or economically that would make it work better for the American middle class? And again, this is a huge question, and I deal with it a lot in the forthcoming book. I think it's right to say that a lot of people in the United States have lost sight of the benefits of what has been accomplished since 1945, 75th anniversary of VE Day this week. I think partly because we take things for granted. We take it for granted that we don't have major wars being fought back and forth across the Atlantic. We take it for granted that all the major democratic governments all the major countries, or almost all of them, are led by some kind of rule of law state, and they are basically friendly to one another. It's such a familiar reality that we stop being grateful for it because we stop seeing it as astonishing in a way that people in the immediate aftermath of World War II saw it as astonishing. And I think there's something else that has gone on that I think so long as the Cold War was in progress, and I have no nostalgia for it, no one should miss the possible imminence of a world nuclear war between the United States and Soviet Union. But one of its perverse countervailing gifts was that it did tend to both sharpen the minds of people in government and to put some limits on the hysterical partisan behavior. At some level, during the Cold War, at least people in and around government knew, we all have to we do face a common adversary, and we have to moderate our behavior, not just in the way we compete, but also uh, in the developed societies, the wealthiest people cannot take all the benefits of progress and prosperity for themselves, because if they do that, they will validate the arguments of the communists and socialists against the free market system. So in order to prove the communists and socialists wrong, you have to share a little bit more than the governing elite of the democratic world has been prone to share since 1990. So I do believe the system remains enormously beneficial. And one of the things I worry about a lot is that there is an emerging agreement, both Trump and anti-Trump, both Democrats and Republicans, to sharpen the competition with China. Look, it's not up to the United States to decide whether the relationship with China will be peaceful and harmonious. The Chinese get a huge vote. But we can certainly not be the people to accelerate the conflict. We can certainly do everything we can to make it clear to the Chinese that we welcome their prosperity and that we are happy to share the world with them if they will agree to share it with us. And then we can build institutions to surround China to offer incentives to good behavior and to limit their ability to do bad behavior. But that means we have to rebuild many of the institutions that got neglected after the end of the Cold War, and to apply them to new countries. I mean, for someone my age, it's strange to think that Vietnam may become one of the most important American partners of the 21st century, but Vietnam may become one of the most important partners of the 21st century. As an authoritarian regime, we have a lot of human rights problems with them, but strategically, they have some common interests, and they may well evolve in ways that are promising. We should never lose hope that authoritarian regimes will open up and deliver better lives for their people. We should maybe spend less time studying the dramatic events. I know it is this anniversary. Study the dramatic events of the war years, and much more the less dramatic, but much more relevant and benign and hopeful events of the 15 years after the war that tend to be swept aside as too technical. But the construction of the European Union should excite us as much, if not more, than all that spectacular video footage of the destruction of European cities. A reader named Naveen that writes a very insider conservative message as follows. What do you think about, I won't name the person because the name won't mean anything to most viewers, I think. What do you think about the argument for Trump that the GOP would have continued Paul Ryanism if not for a shock like Trump? Also, please talk about peaking too early. You championed this vision of conservatism, which you pleaded the GOP to adopt, but you were derided as a heretic. Now some of the very same accusers of the heresy are championing it themselves, forgetting how they derided you for it. How do reformicons like Ross Douthat, Michael Brendan Doherty, Reihan Salam, etc., have managed to stay on positive terms with much of the right while you have been marginalized? Thanks a lot. Did you make any mistakes in navigating those waters during then? If so, what are they? Well, Naveen is referring first to a joke I like to tell a lot about a Tom Wolfe cartoon in which there's a character who goes through all the various cultural adaptations this character went through in the 60s and 70s. And the moral of the story is it is dangerous to be even 10 minutes ahead of the times. And one of the things I've often thought as I've gone through my political evolution over the past 20 years is that I've consistently been a lot more than 10 minutes ahead of the times. And that's had its costs. It's also had its benefits because I don't have to waste so much time talking about yesterday's problems today. But it is true that many of the people who have adapted more in the center of the pack have found themselves more acceptable to the pack. But I would say a couple of things to that, and it's really interesting. It is true that Paul Ryanism, a kind of plutocratic conservatism, was vulnerable to the shock of Trump, that the ideological obsolescence and rigidity of the Republican Party left it open to a populist challenge. And I wrote about that a lot in my book, Why Romney Lost, in 2012, and in Trumpocracy. There's no going back. I don't think any of that is coming back. And I don't worry a whole lot anymore. I used to. I'm human, and there are friendships at stake, and then ego and vanity. I don't worry anymore about my place in the conservative world. I think that really is a chapter of my life that I see as closed, and I leave that work to other people. I'm sure I made mistakes. I'm sure of course I made it. I say what I think. I say it bluntly, directly. Um, you know, uh, I write memorable phrases sometimes, and that's fun for me and sometimes amusing for others. But it's dangerous because memorable phrases get remembered, and if they offend people, then the people never forget. So there is, in a movement like the conservative world, there is a lot of hard work in remaining on good terms with people, and that work is, I don't trivialize that. I salute those who are able to do it. I somehow am not able to do it. But I also think, and this is a personal reflection, I feel, I had a pretty minor role in the Bush administration, but I did have a role, and I was a big supporter of the administration for the early part of the aftermath of the Iraq War. I began to move away on some of the domestic policy issues after about 2005. And I got into that position in great part. I mean, I was not a Middle East expert. I was certainly no expert on Iraq, but I had allies and people I trusted, and people who were on my team, and I listened to a lot of them. And I remember after all of that began to feel like it was behind me, I made a resolution to myself that from now on, I would never make any mistake because a friend of mine had made it first. That any mistakes I was going to make in my life from that point on would be my mistakes and only my mistakes. If I was going to be wrong, I was going to be wrong on my own and never wrong in a group. And I came out of that experience feeling I had a kind of karmic debt to the universe. And so it really shouldn't matter that much what happened to me personally, because I had things I could see and things I could do. And we live in a free country. The penalties for being on your own are pretty small. I've never liked this phrase that some of the anti-Trump people use, the resistance. It seems to me if you're not at risk of being tortured, if you get caught, you shouldn't call yourself the resistance. So given how lenient the penalties are, I mean, there's some economic shocks, there's some social shocks, you lose friendships, but really compared to what other people have had to do at other times, that you should just do what you think is right. And as I think I've joked here before in this format, I have 2 dogs. Right now I have 3. I have a third dog staying with me. So I don't have any problems but having enough friends in Washington. And I should worry instead about doing what I can do. When I wrote something a long time ago, and my wife read it and just tore it apart. And she said about this, it was my Bush book, the first draft. And she said, when you write something like this, you have to decide from the beginning whose side you're on. And are you on the side of the reader, or are you on the side of your former colleagues? And if you're on the side of the reader, you don't have to tell everything. And indeed, a lot of my Bush experience, I kept a diary through the Bush years, and I didn't write. Not all of that made it into the Bush book. And someday, perhaps I'll write something where I use more of that diary material. But you don't have to say everything you know and everything you think, but you should say nothing that you do not sincerely think. And if that bugs people, it just bugs them. What can I do about that? Okay. This may be too specific, but I'll go into it. I'll skip this one and come back if there's time. A reader named Dimitri Guillen writes, "Hello, David. I'm a 26-year-old graduate student from California who has noticed that in recent times, people my age have shown a lot of bitterness toward the baby boomers. I think it's to do with the fact that their children, both of my parents happen to be boomers, are facing bleaker economic circumstances than they ever did. Do you have any thoughts on how generational politics are shaping the current moment and how they may do so in the future?" I worry about this a lot, the conflict between the young and the old. It's one of the major fault lines in American politics, along with rural versus urban, men versus women, and which has become increasingly a political fault line, haves and have-nots, obviously, and of course the familiar racial, ethnic, and cultural gaps. And I don't think it is literally between parents and their own children. I think it's more that in a time of rapid demographic change, that the older generation may not feel it has as much in common with the next generation, because they may feel those are not literally my children. They are somebody else's children. And why should I sacrifice my drive, my suburban lifestyle, my polystyrene cup, my plastic straw to make a better world for people who are so different from me? So finding ways to maintain generational continuity, that is going to be an important part of the politics of the future. And we see that in this epidemic crisis. I mean, at the beginning, there was a lot of glee among younger people that the virus would mostly affect the elderly. There was a joke, it was the boomer remover. And then later it became clear that that's not how the virus took its toll, that actually it was the economic damage was falling on the young, and that the casualties were being inflicted not on all of the old equally, but on black and brown people especially. I think just generally, I think just generally we need to find ways to reignite the spirit of solidarity in American society across generations. And if we do that better, we'll find that we have more spirit of solidarity across generational lines. But, and this goes to one of my more conservative views, I think part of building that spirit of solidarity is you have to slow down the pace of immigration. That a society going through rapid demographic change is not going to feel the spirit of solidarity that a society that is more continuous with itself is going to feel. And as we become more diverse, we become more uncaring toward one another because we feel each other to be more different than we used to do. I think that's just hardwired into the human brain. And that's not an argument for saying, and therefore you must have a static, homogeneous society. That's not a feasible thing either. But you have to, there are limits to everything. There's a balance in everything. And the pace of demographic change is something that is going probably too fast to be consistent with the solidarity ethic. A reader who works inside a Canadian media company writes, you have said Donald Trump and the Republicans are heading for a historic defeat this fall, based in part on the historical record of past elections during an economic crisis. That and the fact that Trump will likely have to campaign with 100,000 plus dead Americans and a double-digit unemployment rate due to his bungling of the pandemic. So how much of a factor is it that Joe Biden's campaign events are confined to basement virtual broadcasts and Trump is on full display? We all see hand-wringing that Biden is deprived of his hands-on retail backslapping politics, which may well be on hold throughout the entire campaign, given that Dems want to be the responsible party vis-a-vis gatherings. Can Biden win from his basement on the slogan, had enough, or does he need to get out there? My own view is this election is Donald Trump's nemesis, that Donald Trump is losing the election, and every time he talks, he loses it more. And the point to Biden is one of the most broadly acceptable politicians we've seen, and I can't think how long. Just that people on the left, the progressive left, complain they're not enthusiastic about it. But when you consider the number of people to whom Biden is unobjectionable, he's probably the least objectionable presidential nominee since, I don't know, a while. So his job is to stay out of the way. I think it's also just realistic, given that his age. I think he has to be really careful about his health, and it would be irresponsible to subject somebody who is the likeliest person to be the next president of the United States to environments in which they might find themselves at serious health risk. His health has to be protected, and he has to pick, in my opinion, a vice presidential running mate who is young and healthy enough that if anything does happen to Biden, that they can, sickness or disability of any kind, that they are ready to do the job from the first moment. But I think, and we've seen some of these events, these ads recently, the message, everyone understands why Biden can't be out there. And you just remind people, he's a normal person, he's broadly acceptable, he's decent, and the status quo is unbearable. That should be enough. Donald Trump is losing the election. And when people talk about this thing that Biden can do to win it or that thing, I think it's really beside the point. Donald Trump is losing this election. David, longtime reader, first-time correspondent. I'm interested in your analysis of the GOP leaders to lead the post-Trump return to decency faction of the party. Trump will be out of power, but will not relinquish his Twitter following or influence on the base. Don Jr. and plenty of opportunistic Trump impersonators will rush to take up the mantle. To counter them, are never Trumpers going to welcome back Sass, Crenshaw, Rubio et al. And forgive their cowardice, or look at new leaders outside Congress who did not sully themselves with Trump apologies. Isn't it the problem that the impeachment acquittal vote must be a red line, but that leaves you no one, bar Romney, actually in Congress? Why should you, Crystal, Matt Lewis, etc., take the slings and arrows for 4 years, only to have to support the likes of Crenshaw, who writes a book on character, then defends Trump? And this is a reader from Ireland who says he's happy for me to use his name, which is James Portstewart. I think it's going to be, I don't think this question is going to arise so fast. I think Republicans are going to take a pretty bad beating up and down the ballot in 2020. And I think Democrats are then going to use their success in 2020 to rewrite a lot of the boundaries to favor more democratic politics at the state level in the decade of the 2020s. So it's going to be harder for these kinds of marginal cultural warriors, which I'm sorry to say that Crenshaw and Sass have become, which they shouldn't. I mean, they are substantial people. Rubio's a somewhat different order of fish. That kind of politics is not going to work. When the Republican Party has renewed itself, it has renewed itself from the states. And I think we are going to see, at least I hope, I believe, and I expect, and I hope that the place where we're going to see the renewal come from are people who have managed state governments competently. Mike DeWine is over 70, unfortunately, but he's been one of the most effective of the governors. Larry Hogan has been an effective governor. I think people like that are going to be the future. But even more fundamentally, I just think the political map is going to be so different. I think I think that the post-Trump era, I think we've been living through one of these periods like the Vietnam period, the civil rights period, where the parties come out of this thing quite scrambled. And the continuity of American politics, which has been such a strong fact through the long period of the baby boomer ascendancy, as the baby boomers pass from the leadership role, I think we're going to see a very discontinuous period. I mean, I anticipate for myself, I'm going to find it very hard to take seriously the pretensions of a Ben Sass. You say you're about character, and then you get a character test, and you fail, and you fail because you put your career ahead of your country. If you did it once, you're going to do that again. That's who you are. Meanwhile, Mitt Romney, who did pass the test, he is going to be, as he will have alienated many Republicans with that vote, and generationally, he will belong to a different time. So I think it's going to be a real turn of the page, a real chapter change. And I think the near future of American politics is not going to look very much like the recent past at all. Thank you. That was a great selection of mail. I'm really grateful for it. Please send more. I will try to be a more frequent recorder of these videos in the coming weeks than I have been over the last week and a half. There was a lot of work to do, and I hope you will be interested in the forthcoming book, Trumpocalypse. There will be a lot of events digitally available to promote that book. And I will again try to take questions about the book once the book itself becomes available after the 26th of May. Thank you for your attention on this Saturday afternoon. Bye-bye.